Welcome to the next installment in our lecture series for American Economic History Online here at Rutgers University. And in this video lecture, I'm going to be going over Chapter 8, which deals with transportation and what is considered a transportation revolution in the United States. And I want you to be keenly aware of a few things when we go over this section. Number one, I want you to realize that the costs of goods during this time period that were shipped, a large component of those costs were attributable to transportation costs. So realize that a large component of goods that were moved in the United States, whether it's throughout the United States or to another point in the world, a large component of the final cost of those goods was attributable to transportation costs, which means that any improvements in technologies related to transportation will lower transportation costs and will by default increase the scope of the marketplace for the individuals producing and selling that market. So I want you to be aware of that, what the implications of transportation improvements is. Number one being the reduction of these costs, the dramatic reduction in these costs, and the fact that the reduction in these costs increased the availability of markets to producers. So we see with transportation improvements, we see the scale and scope of markets increasing. So within the United States, we start to see a national marketplace develop because of these reductions in transportation costs. So we'll go through several different components of transportation during the time period, talk about their significance. And at the very end, I'm going to go over something called the antebellum interregional growth hypothesis. And I think this is important because it touches upon a number of economic terms and philosophy, I won't say philosophies, but it touches a number of economic issues that are of importance, and it relates to transportation changes. The fact that with these transportation changes that we end up seeing a national market develop, and we'll go through what were all the necessary conditions that had to be in place and what this hypothesis talks about. So objectives, the main thing I want everybody to understand is technologic change with regards to transportation and how this impacted economic development. For example, we'll take a look at, very simply, roads. We'll also take a look at canals, the impact of steamboats, and finally the impact of railroads. I want to point out to you that later on we're going to go over railroads in great detail. There's going to be an entire lecture dedicated to the railroads and the impact of railroads on economic development in the United States. But this initial lecture is just going to go over sort of the antebellum period and the changes in transportation technologies that occurred during this time period. All right, so I want you to be aware of the fact that there was a need for these types of internal improvements. All right, so we start seeing people moving in to the western lands of the United States. And there was a desperate need for improvements to the transportation infrastructure. So realize that as we see western migration as new lands open up in the West, Midwest, and even going out to California, the ability to link these areas via a transportation network is very important to fully integrate the marketplace, so that if you produce something in the East Coast, you can sell it in the Midwest or sell it in California. We end up seeing that the infrastructure of transportation allows the development of a national marketplace. Originally, many people thought that the federal government would play a major role in the development of this transportation network. All right? And this actually occurred in 1806. It was a construction of the national road between Cumberland, Maryland, from Cumberland, Maryland to Illinois. All right? So the federal government did initially have some involvement in these internal improvements. And there were also many proposals for federal aid for canal building. All right, and people wanted to use the sale of the public domain, the money that was coming in from the sale of public lands, to help finance canal building and build a transportation infrastructure in the United States. The Gallatin Plan is very important. This Gallatin Plan maps out the importance of having a transportation network and the need for government involvement and a rationale for government involvement. So I want you to make sure you remember what the Gallatin Plan was. All right, it pointed out some initial difficulties. If you have a very large territory, which the United States did at that time, sparsely populated, all right, with people spread out through this large territory, the limitations of that would be a limitation of markets. That if you could connect these sparsely populated regions together with a transportation network, you would be, in fact, creating a national network and improving the markets that are available to for farmers and individuals who are producing, and therefore causing a great deal of economic growth to occur. Furthermore, the Gallatin Plan recognized that there was not enough private capital. If, for example, individuals argued that this must be done by private resources, that there was not enough private capital available to fund these transportation improvements, and that transportation improvements would be slow in occurring because of the limitations of the lack of private capital. So the argument in the Gallatin Plan was that the only feasible way to engage in these transportation network improvements was for the federal government to be involved actively in the creation of this network. The Gallatin Plan also talks about the need to establish communications. All right, another key component of integrating markets. Information in markets is very important. So if you establish a communication link between markets, that will allow those markets to more fully integrate. And also, the Gallatin Plan also realized that these investments were long-term. They had long-term benefits for the country as a whole, which means that they would be undersubscribed by individuals who, in the capitalist system, who are going to be looking for profits. It's going to take a long time to realize those profits, and private capital will not flow towards these types of investments. And this is a justification that Gallatin uses to say that the government needs to be actively involved because there are long-term benefits to this investment in the transportation infrastructure that will not occur from private investment alone. As you can see, the Gallatin Plan had a number of things that it tried to address. Number one, it was a mixture of canal and roads. All right, this is before the full-scale development of steam engines and railroads as viable economic entities. So I want you to realize that the Gallatin Plan came about prior to the commercialization or the large-scale development of steamboats and of railroads. So this was largely a canal and a road plan, and it was integrated to build canals and then connect them with roads. And you can see the cost, $20 million over 10 years, not a large cost, $2 million a year. The plan of Gallatin was also that these were initially to be government projects, and once these projects generated sufficient revenues, started to be viable and profitable, they could be sold to private individuals and generate revenues for additional projects. So the thought of the Gallatin Plan was there to be government investment in these projects, get them up, get them running, start generating revenues, and then after they become economically viable, to sell those to private individuals. And at the sales of those projects, the roads, the canals, etc., the revenues from those sales would then be used to further finance additional projects. Realize that the Gallatin Plan was never adopted. So I want you to realize, number one, what the initial thrust of the Gallatin Plan was, and then also realize why it was never adopted. All right, a number of political figures, particularly Madison or Monroe, favored participation by the federal government, but they felt that the federal action within states was unconstitutional, that was a separation that occurred in the Constitution, and it was unconstitutional for the federal government to be involved in these projects within states. A lot of people at the time viewed this expansion of federal power with a great deal of suspicion. And that's a common theme that we're going to talk about, specifically when we talk about banking. We'll talk about the first and second bank of the United States. That we realize that the reason why we fought the Revolutionary War was because we feared centralized power. So anytime there was talk during this beginning period of the United States of an expansion of federal power, there was a great deal of the populace that looked upon that expansion with a great deal of suspicion. All right, Madison, even though he felt it was unconstitutional, thought the plan was to amend the Constitution to allow these two, so to specifically change the Constitution and add an amendment that specifically stated that the federal government could be involved in these types of internal projects. And finally, the plans of Gallatin faded completely when Andrew Jackson vetoed the Maysville Road project. He stated specifically it was unconstitutional. So in the 1830s, the Gallatin plan pretty much died out with veto by President Jackson. So let's take a look at roads. I mean, obviously roads are important today, and roads were an important component of the transportation infrastructure in the early 1800s. At the time, realized that what we saw were turnpikes. We still use the phrase turnpikes. And so remember that if I talk about something referring to a turnpike, in essence, a turnpike was an inner-city toll road that you had to pay. It was not a public area that anybody could use. If you wanted to use the road, you had to pay an individual to use that particular road. I want to point out to you that there are a number of vestiges of turnpikes from the history of the United States. If you're from the South Jersey area, you might know of roads that are referred to, for example, as the White Horse Pike or the Black Horse Pike. Route 30 and Route 168 in South Jersey were once turnpike roads. They were private roads that individuals owned and charged individuals to use those roads. All right. Some people still refer to Route 70 as the Marlton Pike. That was a turnpike road. Also, there was a turnpike road that connected Camden, went through, for example, Pennsauken, Cherry Hill, Maple Shade, through Morristown, what some people refer to as Camden Avenue, Main Street, I believe they refer to that, Maple Shade. That road there was a turnpike road. So I want you to realize this region has roads that were formerly turnpikes. What happened was these were all privately owned roads, and then I believe in the 1900s, 1910, 1920, the county started to buy up these roads and made them public roads. So I want you to realize that this region was once populated with turnpike roads. These private roads, number one, their advantage was they were more dependable. They had stone surfaces, gravel surfaces. Some of them actually had wood planks for a road surface. So they were more dependable. It decreased the transportation times between regions. More desirable ride if you were moving, for example, items that could be broken. If you took on public roads, the public roads were generally in very, very poor shape during this time period. All right. The benefits is that it included, they directly link large population centers. So if you were building something, a manufacturer or a farmer in Camden, you could sell them in other areas of the state. You could sell them, for example, Camden was connected by a whole host of roads. So you could go into what is now Marlton, those areas, with the White Horse Pike, Black Horse Pike, Marlton Pike, etc., that you could sell your product to more markets. So you had more markets available to you, and therefore you had a higher level of profitability. All right. So realize that during this time period that there was quite a bit of money. Remember, we talked about the Gallatin plan spending $20 million over 10 years. $2 million a year. There were 25 of $25 million invested in private, and there were several hundred turnpike companies during this time period. I want you to realize also that how road mileage increased. In 1810, it's about 5,000 miles of road in the United States, and by 1830 there was a little more than 5 times that amount of road. So a 20-year time period, we see a 5-fold increase in the number of roads. All right. Most turnpike companies realized they were not large roads. They did not have a large expanse of hundreds of miles. They would probably be 20 to 30 to 40 miles long. And if you were going to go long distances, for example, you might have to take several different turnpikes to actually get there. I was recently driving along the roads from through Camden and Pensacola, Maple Shade, and Morristown. I believe they still have what looked like to me they had stone mile markers still placed along the route. I have to double check them and check with some historians, but they look like stone mile markers from that time period. Several on the route. I saw a couple in Pensacola, Maple Shade, and Morristown along that particular route. I was surprised that they were still there. Turnpikes, generally, the ones that did make a profit were generally low profit margin items. Realize that the ones that were profitable, and there was no guarantee from the research that I've seen, what people have done, that in general the turnpike system in the United States was not profitable. Quite a few turnpikes lost money and shut down during the time period, and the ones that were profitable only made about a 3 to 4% rate of return on their investment. And then realize that even with all this investment, we see a substitution away from roads. As canals get further built and railroads become more economically viable, more reliable, and they become more available to individuals, that the road network gets supplanted by the canal and railroad network in the 1830s and onward. All right, the canals. All right. We see that the fact that we see public-private ventures becoming more and more part of this development. I want you to realize, though, that most turnpikes were privately financed, were private endeavors, and with the canals, we end up seeing a greater impact of the government being involved in assisting financing. Take a look at some of these numbers, and you can see from 1850 to 1844, you can see the federal government, the total investment, I'm sorry, I know it doesn't have to be the federal government, that there were $30 million worth of investment in canals, and the next 16-year time period saw a doubling of that. So I want you to realize that the amount of railroad investment accelerated from the beginning of the 1800s. On the eve of the Civil War, we see a dramatic increase in canal investment. And you can see the vast majority of the investment in these canals were governmental investments. Roughly 70% of investment in canals came from government sources. The most famous of the canals in the United States is the Erie Canal. And the reason why it was probably the most successful in terms of the amount of freight that was moved along it and the profitability of it. So if you want to give a specific example of a canal that was actually profitable, it was the Erie Canal. I want you to realize it was completed in 1825, and the impact of the canal on transportation costs were quite dramatic. Before the Erie Canal, if you wanted to ship a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City, it would cost you $100 per ton. After the Erie Canal opened, that same ton of wheat could be shipped for $10 a ton. So you can see how this decrease in transportation costs is going to dramatically impact the prices of goods that are shipped, and therefore the size of the market that those goods can be shipped to. Realize this, that it's going to cost you, that you could ship the 10 times as much wheat from Buffalo to New York City for the same price after the opening of the Erie Canal. Also, after the opening of the Erie Canal, the shipping time from Buffalo to New York fell by 1/3. So it's costing less in direct cost, but it's also costing less in the terms of opportunity costs and travel times. The important thing about the Erie Canal is that a lot of settlement that was occurring prior to its opening was in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and once the Erie Canal started to open up, the Great Lakes, the settlement of the Great Lakes started to be opened up because transportation costs were much lower. It was more economically viable to open up a farm, start a farm, or open up a business in the Great Lakes region because you could effectively transport those to New York City and to other areas of the East Coast. You could market those goods to a far greater area. And then eventually, once we start talking about international transport, that once you get that wheat to New York City, that means you can fairly easily ship those goods, if they're non-perishable goods, onto Europe. So it also opens up European markets to production, farm production, industrial production in the Midwest. All right. Initially, there was a proposal to use federal financing to help build the Erie Canal, and that was vetoed by Madison, and Madison thought it was probably unconstitutional because that was the main argument against federal involvement in these internal transportation improvements. So the New York legislature stepped in to build the law. So I want you to realize that the New York legislature themselves and the citizens of New York are the ones that financed the building of the Erie Canal. All right? And by state funding only. Taxes, state credit, and they used the tolls as sections of the canal opened up. So what they did is they built the canal in sections, opened those sections up, and started to generate revenues before the entire canal was completed. When it was completed, 363 miles long, and it cost us $7 million. The important thing, and I want you to realize about the financing of this, is that the bond issues were initially of very small denominations, meaning that they could sell those bonds to more individuals instead of making these large denomination bonds where people would have to put up $1,000. They would put bonds out that were of much smaller denomination, which opened up the availability to invest in the Erie Canal to more and more individuals, people with more modest means. So this was not just for people who had a lot of money to invest in. Pretty much anybody in the state of New York could. And these initial bond issues were almost exclusively purchased by citizens of the state of New York. So the citizens of the state of New York pretty much financed this themselves through taxes, through credit, and then the tolls that were collected. Realize this, that when it opened and it became evident that there was a lot of traffic that was going to be flowing through the Erie Canal and it was going to be largely profitable, foreign investors started to purchase the debt of the Erie Canal. So this is I want to point out that this is a watershed moment because we start seeing more and more foreign credit flowing into the United States. What's this telling us is the fact that foreigners were starting to believe that this is good debt. We could lend money to enterprises in the United States and they're going to pay us back. So it's the start of the belief, a worldwide belief, that the United States was a safe haven for investments, that there were investment opportunities in the United States. But realize this was largely proved by the citizens of New York who basically self-financed the Erie Canal. Realize that, as with other things, people try to imitate. So the impact of the Erie Canal, the success of the Erie Canal, was that individuals tried to imitate this. They saw that the Erie Canal was a great financial success, was profitable. They saw markets opening up for individuals, and the individuals located near the canal are seeing improved levels of higher levels of economic activity. So obviously, in the United States, people will want to mimic that. They'll build their own canals because they feel, well, this canal was successful. We can do the same and be just as successful. All right, so we can see that happening, and in Pennsylvania, for example, there was a great deal of investment in canals, and there was actually something referred to as the Gallatin Plan for Pennsylvania. State invested tax funds in 56 turnpikes and bridge companies with $1.8 million. And with this money that Pennsylvania had invested, the Erie Canal posed a threat because it was cheaper to actually ship goods along the Erie Canal. So the Erie Canal was a direct competitor to the investments that were made by Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania decided to build the Long Island Canal, roughly spending about $12 million. So they were worried about the Erie Canal competing against them, taking away transportation business or the services associated with transporting goods. The thing that I want you to realize about the mainline canal wasn't very successful. All right, like as it says down here, the mainline canal made a return of about 3% compared to 7% for the Erie Canal. So the Erie Canal was about twice as profitable. But the thing is that it wasn't directly relatable, because the mainline canal was not just a canal system, but it was a project that involved the transfer of cargo to surface vessels at several points. So you would move goods along the canal, they would be unloaded on a road, shipped along the road, then reloaded on a new section of canal, shipped along that canal, unloaded. So those are referred to breakpoints. Whenever you change types of transportation, i.e. you go from transporting from canal to rail or road or steamboat or whatever, and you have to unload and reload, that's a breakpoint. So it put the canal at a considerable cost disadvantage compared to the Erie Canal, which was a continuously operated canal. So realize what was the limitations of the mainline canal. The limitations of the mainline canal were the fact that there were several breakpoints in that canal system where you had to unload from the canal, load onto road transportation, transport by road, then reload back onto a canal. And this dramatically impacted the cost structure. It was more costly to move items along the mainline canal than it was along the Erie Canal. And just realize this, take a look at, there are a number of canals. And I just want you to realize the scope of canals that were built. I know this is a little bit small, but if you take a look at this, I have it loaded up on the resources. You can see here the Delaware and Raritan Canal. That's right along Rutgers, New Brunswick, that actually was built. But I want you to realize that, look at the number of canals that are built in the Northeast during this time period. All right, so we see the Erie Canal along here, but we see a whole host of canals that end up being built. So what you see is there's a great canal building period, mostly due to the success of the Erie Canal. We also have to discuss the technological development of steam engines and steamboats. All right, and this is in particular to the internal river system. I want you to realize that when we're talking about steamboats during this period, we're talking about the Ohio, Missouri, and the Mississippi rivers. All right, and if you're a farmer on the interior, this cheap transportation allows you to get your crops to New Orleans and brought back manufactured items at a lower cost. In particular, I want you to realize that this was more important, the steam transportation was more important for upstream transportation. There was a dramatic difference between, for example, if you floated your product down to the New Orleans along the Mississippi River, obviously you had the benefit of gravity helping it, but if you tried to ship things back up against the stream of the Mississippi, the costs, I believe, were somewhere along 10 times more expensive. So the development of the steam engine and the use of steamboats particularly lowered upstream transportation costs. Also realize that one of the things to talk about with steamboats is this is relatively a new technology, and there were issues with any new technology. For example, the working life of a steamboat was roughly 5 to 6 years prior to 1860. So an investment in steamboats did not mean that you were going to use your steamboat for 10, 15, or 20 years. You only had a 6-year window to use that steamboat. And also realize the level of investment. Steamboats were incredibly expensive. 85% of existing firms. So if you bought a steamboat, your steamboat, the capital expenditure of that steamboat was greater than 85% of the capital to start up the firms that existed. All right, and it was the average price of a farm, or at the average firm, it was 6 times the capital expenditure for an average firm. Um, and as I told you previously, that this had a big impact on upstream transportation costs. It almost fell by 100%, a 90% decrease in the upstream cost of transporting goods, and there was a 40% decrease in downstream rates. And this table 8.1 just gives you an indication of how quickly the steamboat industry grew. In 1811, there was only one steamboat operator on the western rivers. This increased by a factor of 7 in 1815, and again we see an increase of about 9 times by 1820. So we end up seeing dramatic increases, and after that we just see steady growth through the remainder of the decades leading up until the Civil War. So I want you to realize that steamboats grew consistently in importance, particularly on the western rivers for river transportation in the middle part of the United States. And finally we get to railroads. All right, and the railroads are very important. As I told you previously, we're going to have a separate lecture dedicated completely to the impact of the railroads on economic growth in the United States. All right, and according to historians, it played a very central and pivotal role in the development of the economy of the United States. Much more than other forms of competition, it was perceived that railroads opened up the country, that the railroads were responsible for fully integrating the marketplace of the United States and linking the sparsely populated large tract of land that we had. The railroads were largely responsible for that. And that the fact that railroads sharply reduced transportation costs, expanded markets, and spurred economic growth. One argument that I want you to be aware of is that for many decades, the prevailing wisdom was that the railroads were built ahead of demand, that railroads were built before they were actually needed. All right, so this was taken as truth, that the railroads were built before they were really needed, and they actually caused a great deal of the economic development that occurred. And Robert Fishlow actually investigated this. And when he takes a look at the investment in railroads, he finds that mainly railroads went into areas already populated and developed. So this notion that railroads were built ahead of demand, this global notion of that, Fishlow basically shows that that part of it is not true, that the railroads actually went into areas that were already populated. And there's other research that shows that the railroads had a significant impact on economic growth. So I want you to realize that the prevailing wisdom was that railroads were built ahead of demand and had a dramatic impact on the development of the United States. Fishlow finds that to be the opposite, that the railroads actually mainly went into populated and developed areas, but they still had a significant impact on economic growth in the United States. The important component of the railroads is they connected population centers. All right, so you're connecting markets, one established market to another established market. And the one thing that the railroads had a tendency to do was that where they connected regions, that the land between those two regions ended up increasing in value. So the railroads themselves had the impact of increasing land values where they were located. Also, railroads, as I said previously, one of the things that you should make sure that you remember is that a prevailing wisdom that the railroads were a major cause of economic growth in the 1880s. When we do the section on the railroads separately, we're going to see that this statement's not quite as strong. But the thing, and we'll talk about this in this section, that what Fogel ends up doing after Fishlow was that if you had taken the railroads out and said that technology never existed, the river and canal system would have nearly produced the same exact results. So he undermines the belief that the railroads were central to economic development in the United States. And just giving you an indication of how the expansion of railroads in the United States. As you can see, there was a dramatic increase from 1830 to 1835. All right. 50-time increase in rail miles, a double in 35 to 40, and it's almost as if the number of rail miles doubles every single 5-year period. And again, just taking a look at this map, this gives you an indication of the development of the rail network in the United States. Also, I want you to realize the importance that communication changes in the communication and infrastructure. That business communication took the form of handwritten letters. Today we take it for granted that we can send an email across the world in an instant. Send an email to somebody in Europe or in Africa, as long as they have a connection, they will get that email. I mean, back then this did not occur. You had handwritten letters going back and forth between two people. Realized in 1840 the Postal Service lowered rates, so it decreased communication costs and increased the amount of communication that actually occurred. Also realized that these new modes of transportation reduced travel time, but in essence it also decreased the cost of gathering information, and the development of the telegraph during this time period further decreased the cost of gaining information. Here is an important thing that I want everybody to understand: the antebellum interregional growth hypothesis. And make sure that you realize several components. One, that the North is associated with industry, the South, cotton, and the Midwest in the production of foodstuffs. And that the fact that we had these infrastructure investments that lowered transportation costs allowed for regional specialization to occur. The reason was that because of these lower transportation costs, it effectively increased the market for northern industrial production, southern cotton production, and Midwest food production. If these transportation costs were prohibitively high, each region would have had to have been self-sufficient and inefficiently produced all the items that it needed. With the improvement in the transportation infrastructure and the lowering of transportation costs that occurred because of that, it allowed regional specialization to occur. So I want you to realize that what this is talking about is, why did regional specialization occur? And this infrastructure, the improvements in the infrastructure of the transportation network, is vitally important to that occurring. The improvement in the transportation infrastructure allowed national markets to develop, allowed regions to specialize in what they had the comparative advantage. All right, so the factors that are important to understanding that is that we had a national free trade zone, that states were not allowed to regulate trade, and a company in New Jersey could freely sell goods in Pennsylvania, New York, etc. So we didn't have 13 individual trade zones, we had one unified national trade zone. That the decrease in transportation costs increased the effective market that individuals could sell a particular product. And the fact that they had an information network developing with postal service, with the ability to be able to transport yourself or move from one region to the next, and also the telegraph network gave you information about prices in different regions, which allowed you to ship. If you realize that the product that you were producing was selling at a much higher price in Atlanta, then you could ship that product to Atlanta if that higher price allowed you to recoup those additional transportation costs. And here we just have a relative measuring of the rates by per ton mile. And that's what's measured. You have a ton of goods per mile that you have to move. For example, as you can see here, if you take a look at the upstream river rates, much higher than downstream, and as you can see here, there's a big drop off right around 1820. That's with steamships. So you see a dramatic decrease in the costs of river rates because of the implementation of the steam engine. We even see the wagon rates falling. Why? Because we see improvements in the road structure during this time period. So as we see an improvement in the availability of roads, those wagon rates of moving along roads decreases. And then we also see, after in the 1840s, we see the canal rates start to fall. And I would bet that that's mostly due to the competition from the railroads. As you can see, prior to that, we don't see competition in railroads, but once the railroads start to compete against canals, we see dramatic decreases in canal rates as the railroads compete against canals, and as they become more and more cost competitive, canals have to cut their prices in order to compete against railroads. We do see spikes in the cost of transportation, particularly downriver transportation, and in canal rates, and we see railroad rates increasing during this time period. But again, you can see this falls right around 1864, which is the period of the Civil War, so we would expect there to be increases in transportation costs during that time period.